It was supposed to be a calm, peaceful weekend. I'd worked hard all week, and finally, I had the chance to unplug. No traffic, no meetings, no chaos. Just me, nature, and my tent beside the lake. I set it up in a quiet, grassy area that offered a perfect view of the water. It was far enough from the homes around the lake to not bother anyone. I wasn't blaring music, starting fires, or throwing parties. Just one man, a fold-out chair, a good book, and a gentle sound of water lapping the shore. But peace doesn't sit well with people who live to control others. And that's where Karen comes in. I noticed her the moment I arrived, standing on her porch, squinting in my direction like I was setting up a missile silo instead of a camping tent. I gave her a polite nod. She didn't return it. I shrugged it off. It wasn't the first time I'd run into nosy neighbors, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. I figured she'd get bored and go back to whatever HOA-related spreadsheet she probably had open on her computer. I was wrong. Barely 30 minutes after I'd settled in, I heard the unmistakable clack of sandals on pavement. I turned to see Karen marching toward me with that look, the one where you just know she's about to say something absurd. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, sunglasses that somehow made her frown even more dramatic. "Excuse me, sir," she started, already hostile. "Do you live here?" I told her no, but I owned the land I was on and had every right to be there. That's when she hit me with the HOA classic. "Well, I'm the head of the Lakeview Shores Neighborhood Committee, and we have rules about this kind of thing." I almost laughed. First off, I wasn't part of their HOA. Second, the land I was on wasn't even under their jurisdiction. But that didn't stop her. Karen was the kind of person who thought if she spoke confidently enough, the law would just bend to her will. She demanded I take the tent down immediately. I calmly repeated that I was on my own property. That's when she whipped out her phone and said the words I still find hilarious to this day. "Fine, I'll let the authorities handle this." And just like that, she called 911. Not a local complaint line. Not even non-emergency dispatch. Nope. She went full throttle. Emergency services for a man sitting in a lawn chair next to a tent on his own land. You could hear the urgency in her voice, too. The dramatic emphasis on unauthorized camping and possible trespassing. She even threw in that I looked suspicious. I sat there, stunned at how far she was willing to go for a power trip. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I just sipped my drink and waited. 10 minutes later, a sheriff's vehicle pulled up. Karen, beaming with satisfaction, walked over to greet them like she'd just saved the community from a terrorist plot. The deputy approached me with a calm, professional demeanor. I greeted him respectfully and handed over my ID and property documents without any fuss. He reviewed everything, then walked back to Karen. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I saw her posture change in real time, from smug to confused to absolutely fuming. Her arms crossed tighter. She started shaking her head. The deputy pointed toward my tent, then down to the paperwork. Karen's mouth moved fast, hands flailing as she argued. The deputy remained firm. Eventually, she stormed off, heels clicking against the pavement like she was trying to break the ground itself. The deputy came back to me, apologized for the inconvenience, and confirmed what I already knew. I was well within my rights, and there was nothing she or the HOA could do. But that moment told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about a tent or a rule. It was about power. Karen saw something she couldn't control, and she reacted the only way she knew how, by escalating a peaceful situation into a dramatic showdown. She weaponized the HOA and 911 as if they were her personal tools. She didn't care about the truth. She cared about control. And that's when I decided to do a little digging of my own. After the 911 call debacle, I figured the worst of it was over. The deputy had come, checked my documents, confirmed my rights, and left without incident. Karen had walked back to her house, clearly embarrassed but still full of that smug defiance only an HOA warrior could maintain. I assumed, naively, that she'd learned her lesson and would finally let it go. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA, or worse, someone who runs one, you know that logic doesn't apply. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my truck window. I had dozed off in the front seat after enjoying the cool breeze coming off the lake. I opened the door and saw a man in khakis and a tucked-in polo shirt holding a clipboard, flanked by another resident in business casual gear. They looked like they were headed to a HOA brunch seminar. Before I could ask what was going on, the man spoke up. "We're with the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association. We've had some complaints about an unauthorized structure on HOA-adjacent property. You're going to need to dismantle your tent and vacate the area within 24 hours, per the community covenant." Now I was fully awake. I asked him what covenant he was referring to, because as far as I knew, and as far as my legal paperwork stated, my land wasn't even part of their neighborhood. He gave me this tight-lipped smile, the kind that comes with a long history of writing passive-aggressive emails and enforcing pool rules in December. "The HOA has jurisdiction over visual harmony within lake-facing lines of sight," he said, like he was quoting some ancient scroll. "Your tent is within view of 3 member properties, and it's violating our aesthetics code." I couldn't help but laugh. Not mockingly, just in disbelief. Visual harmony? That was a new one. According to this man, my earth-toned, perfectly neat camping tent was causing a visual disturbance that offended the curated symmetry of lakeside McMansions. He didn't laugh back. I explained again that I was on land I owned, that I was disturbing no one, and that I was not, and never had been, a part of the Lakeview Shores HOA. I had bought this sliver of land years ago during an off-market deal that most of the nearby homeowners didn't even know happened. It had been a forgotten plot, wedged awkwardly between 2 larger parcels and surrounded by private roads, but it had its own deed and title, fair and square. The clipboard guy sighed and pulled out a highlighted document that looked like it had been photocopied too many times. It referenced something about shared visual standards for adjacent undeveloped parcels. I pointed out that it had no legal power over land not under HOA jurisdiction, and that any attempt to enforce it on a non-member landowner would likely violate property rights. That's when he changed tactics. He mentioned fines. He said that if I didn't comply, I could face penalties for visual code violations and unauthorized land use. I asked where they'd be sending these fines, since the HOA had no access to my address or any legitimate authority over my land. He didn't have an answer, just that smug HOA look like the weight of the board's approval gave him power. It was clear by then that this wasn't about community rules. It was about Karen again. She hadn't let it go. She had likely gone to the board, spun her version of the story, and rallied them to come after me with their full HOA rulebook in hand. Even after the sheriff had told her she was in the wrong, she couldn't stand the idea of me existing outside of her control. The idea that someone could sit in a tent and watch the lake without checking in, filling out a form, or asking for HOA permission was too much for her. She saw my independence as a threat to the carefully constructed illusion of control she and her clipboard friends thrived on. The lake, in her eyes, wasn't meant to be enjoyed freely. It was meant to be monitored, restricted, and regulated into oblivion. They wanted me gone not because I was bothering anyone, but because I refused to submit. The tent was just the excuse. The real issue was that I was reminding them that their rules didn't apply everywhere, that not everyone was part of their little club, that someone could exist outside their bubble and still enjoy the same view, the same breeze, the same piece of paradise without their approval. After the HOA's failed attempt to bully me off my own property with vague threats and visual harmony nonsense, I decided it was time to do a little research of my own. I already knew they didn't have jurisdiction over my land, but I wanted to understand exactly why they were acting so confident and what made them believe they could enforce anything on me. It was more than just entitlement. It was ignorance backed by paperwork they probably never read thoroughly. So I dug deeper. I pulled up property maps, zoning layouts, and every public record I could find about Lakeview Shores. I cross-referenced their HOA charter with the county assessor's database. It didn't take long before I noticed something very, very interesting. There was a thin strip of land, about 20 feet wide and just under 200 feet long, that cut through the middle of their so-called private drive. At first glance, it looked like it belonged to the HOA, but when I traced the parcel number, it was clearly marked under private ownership. Not HOA managed, not public utility, private. So I kept digging. Well, I found floored me. That narrow strip? It was purchased almost 10 years ago by a developer who apparently went bankrupt and sold off all his assets, but the records never got fully updated. Turns out, that same strip had been auctioned off in a quiet tax sale 2 years ago for almost nothing. And the best part? The buyer was a property flipper I'd done business with years ago. We weren't close friends, but we'd worked a few deals together. I gave him a call. Not only did he still own it, he had no use for it. He hadn't even visited the land and didn't realize the HOA had been using it as part of their road. He thought it was a worthless scrap. When I explained what was going on, how the HOA had built their private road right over it without securing ownership, he practically laughed. I made him an offer right there on the phone. A clean, fast cash deal. No agents, no inspecciones. Just the legal paperwork, fair market value, and a handshake. Within days, I owned it. That little 200-foot stretch of pavement was now mine. The crown jewel in a war I hadn't even planned to fight until Karen made it personal. I didn't need to own it. I didn't even want it until they forced my hand. And now, thanks to a sloppy HOA and a trail of paperwork, they never bothered to verify. Their entire access route rested on land they didn't control. You could call it poetic justice. Karen had called 911 on me over a tent. The HOA had sent their goons with clipboards. All of it was based on the idea that they held the power. But the truth is, power comes from knowing what you actually own and what others think they do. It didn't take long for them to notice. A few weeks after I finalized the sale, I put up a modest little sign at the edge of the road. Private property. No unauthorized access without owner's consent. I didn't block anything yet. I didn't install gates or fences yet. I simply let them know that their road now passed through someone else's land. And not just anyone. Me. The reaction was instant. Within 48 hours, I got a courtesy call from an HOA representative asking to discuss the signage situation. I told them I was happy to talk, but they'd need to schedule a formal request in writing, as any access now required documented permission. Their tone changed fast. The conversation shifted from "we'd like to resolve this" to "this is going to create unnecessary tension." They still didn't seem to get it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the consequence of years of sloppy management and blind enforcement. They assumed that because they'd paved over land, it automatically became theirs. But land doesn't work that way. Ownership is legal, not emotional. You can't HOA your way out of title deed. And now, I had the documents to prove it. Everything they'd built, from the entrance signs to the manicured median strips, relied on a road that ran through my property. Their community's only access route was now subject to the terms I set. Karen's house? It sat just beyond that strip. She'd have to pass over my land every time she backed out of her driveway. And thanks to her crusade over my harmless little tent, I now had every reason to make that fact matter. Once the property transfer was finalized and my name was officially on the deed, I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA came crawling back. They had built their entire street system without confirming land ownership. It was one of those arrogant oversights that you only expect from people who think rules are for everyone else. For years, they had paved, landscaped, and maintained what they thought was their private drive, when in reality, that drive sat smack in the middle of now my property. I didn't go nuclear right away. I started with polite firmness. A legal notice went out to the HOA board, letting them know that their continued use of my private property was a liability issue, and I could no longer allow it without a formal access agreement in place. That meant they either had to lease the land or reroute their entire street, which would cost them hundreds of thousands. The letter was direct, lawful, and non-negotiable. I even gave them a generous window to respond. Of course, they tried to ignore it at first. They probably assumed it was a bluff. They were used to pushing people around with certified letters and lawyer talk. But this time, they weren't the ones holding the leverage. I didn't need access to their community. They needed access through mine. 3 weeks passed. No reply. That's when I moved to step 2. I applied for access control zoning with the county, since my property now contained what had functionally become a private road. The application process was smooth. I had no HOA restrictions, the land was properly zoned, and there was no legal reason to deny it. The minute that application was approved, I had the right to limit who used that road and when. So I did. I hired a local contractor to install a temporary barrier. 2 large posts with a thick chain across the drive, just wide enough to keep vehicles from passing. I put up signage stating, "Private property, authorized vehicles only." I left enough space for emergency vehicles and didn't fully obstruct access, but sent the message loud and clear. The HOA didn't own the road anymore. They had to ask permission. That same afternoon, I saw Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed, phone in hand again. She looked like she was waiting for someone to stop me, like this was all some weird performance, and the cops were about to swoop in and save her suburban kingdom. Except this time, there were no cops. Just silence. The barrier went up, the signs went down, and not a single official showed up to challenge it. The next day, the HOA sent me a formal letter demanding the removal of the barrier. They claimed I was disrupting the community's flow of traffic and intentionally causing distress to residents. I forwarded that letter to my attorney, who responded with a polite reminder that they had been trespassing on my land for years, and I had every right to control it now. If they wanted it open back up, they could come to the table and negotiate. By the end of the week, things escalated. I started receiving emails from residents asking what was going on. Some were polite and genuinely curious. Others were angry, accusing me of trying to sabotage the neighborhood. I didn't respond to the hostile ones, but I did speak with a few of the calm, reasonable folks. I explained the situation. The land had never belonged to the HOA, and now that I owned it, I had the right to manage its use. If they wanted access restored, it would need to be handled through a lease or right-of-way agreement. What surprised me was how many of them had no idea. They assumed their HOA owned everything in the neighborhood. They never imagined that their own driveways connected to land that wasn't legally theirs. And once I showed them the maps and documents, most of them understood. They weren't happy, but they got it. Karen, on the other hand, refused to back down. She tried to rally support, started a petition, and even called a special HOA board meeting to try and get the county involved. But it was too late. The zoning was legal, the ownership clear, and her influence was slipping fast. She wasn't just losing control of the road. She was losing face in front of the very people she had bullied for years. And the best part? Her driveway was one of the closest to the new barrier. Every time she left her house, she had to look at that sign. Every time she backed out, she was reminded that she no longer dictated the rules. Once the barrier was up and the signage made everything official, the mood in the neighborhood shifted. It wasn't immediate chaos, just a slow, growing tension that settled into the air like fog. People who used to wave as they drove past suddenly avoided eye contact. Homeowners who'd once felt smug behind their HOA contracts now started checking their mailboxes a little more nervously. But the one who took it hardest, as expected, was Karen. Her driveway was located just 30 feet from where the private section of the road began. In other words, she couldn't leave her house without confronting the reality of what she'd caused. The thick chain across the pavement, the bold-lettered "No Unauthorized Access" sign, and the newly placed postbox with my name on it. It all served as a constant reminder. And she hated every second of it. At first, she tried to act like it didn't matter. She parked on the grass and stomped over to her neighbor's driveway to access the main road, like some minor inconvenience wasn't going to break her stride. But that didn't last long. A few HOA residents started getting annoyed that Karen was now using their driveways to get around the barrier. The very people she once rallied with newsletters and fines were now quietly grumbling about her behavior. Soon, I started receiving requests, not from a board, but from individual homeowners. They want to know if I'd be willing to offer personal access passes, maybe just for longtime residents or those who didn't support the HOA's actions. They want to make deals under the table, behind the board's back. It was a complete shift from a unity they'd projected just a few weeks earlier. But I wasn't interested in cutting secret deals. I wanted Karen to feel the inconvenience she had so casually dished out to others. For years, she had patrolled the neighborhood like a security guard in a gated community, ticketing people for mailbox paint, lawn length, and driveway oil stains. And now, the same person who once called 911 over a harmless tent had to walk an extra 100 feet just to get to her car. She wasn't having it. One morning, I caught her pacing near the barrier, phone in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other as she tried to convince someone, probably the county or her attorney, that this was harassment. She pointed at the sign. She pointed at my truck. She even tried to wave down a passing utility worker to plead her case. But nothing happened, because there was nothing anyone could do. The chain stayed up, and then came the escalation. One afternoon, I got a knock on my camper door. It was a process server. Karen had officially filed a civil complaint. Her claim was that I was unlawfully impeding community access, despite the fact that I owned the land and had every legal right to control it. I handed the papers to my attorney, who read them, laughed, and said, "This is just noise." He filed a counterclaim, trespassing, retroactive land use compensation, and legal fees. The HOA board must have realized the storm that was brewing, because suddenly they came forward with a very different tone. They wanted to open a dialogue. They wanted to avoid ongoing hostilities. They wanted to restore community harmony. I agreed to meet, with my lawyer present, of course. At the meeting, I laid out my terms. A proper lease for right-of-way access, monthly payments, legal acknowledgement of my land ownership, and a signed agreement that the HOA would never again attempt to govern any part of my property. They balked, especially Karen. She tried to argue that the road had been theirs by tradition. My lawyer reminded her that tradition isn't a legal defense. Eventually, it became clear that they had no choice. But even as negotiations dragged on, the chain remained, and Karen's driveway stayed boxed in. Her carefully curated suburban life, where she dictated who could plant what and where people could park, had unraveled. And now she lived every day boxed behind a barrier she helped create. Neighbors started whispering about her. Some of the more annoyed ones even came up to me in private, thanking me for putting her in her place. Others stayed silent, but you could see it in their eyes. They knew the reign of the clipboard queen was finally over. The HOA had tried to push me off land I owned. They tried to find me, control me, and drag me through court. But in the end, they were the ones navigating around barriers and writing apology letters. And Karen, the woman who once roamed the neighborhood with a measuring tape and a bad attitude, now had to take the long way out of her own driveway every single morning. The HOA board finally realized they were trapped. Every legal angle they tried only made their position weaker. Karen's civil complaint was dismissed in court without even going to trial, and my counterclaim for retroactive trespassing and damages was moving forward. They were bleeding money on legal fees, losing credibility with their own residents, and watching their so-called private drive become a community bottleneck. What had started as a petty overreaction to a man camping in peace had turned into a full-scale disaster for their little suburban empire. That's when a real shift happened. The board, minus Karen, who had by then burned every bridge within shouting distance, sent me a formal proposal. They were ready to pay for access. Monthly rent, full legal acknowledgement of the property boundaries, liability insurance, and an easement agreement that respected my authority over the strip of road they had carelessly paved over years ago. I reviewed it, made a few revisions, and sent it back with one final addition. A clause that allowed me to revoke access with 30 days' notice if any member of the HOA attempted to enforce rules on me or my land again. They signed it. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't just some guy with a tent anymore. I had become the private gatekeeper to their entire neighborhood. Every car that came and went, every Amazon delivery, every landscape crew, real estate agent, and pizza guy had to pass over my land. I didn't abuse the power. I wasn't out to punish anyone who hadn't been involved. But I made sure it was known that the days of HOA arrogance were over. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't handle it. She was no longer on the board, but she still strutted around like she was in charge. She refused to speak to me directly, sending passive-aggressive notes through her mailbox or trying to rally her remaining allies to stand up against this. But there was nothing left to stand on. The contract was signed. The land was mine. The rules had changed. One Saturday, I decided to make it even more official. I held a small cookout right at the edge of my property where the barrier had once stood. A few neighbors who had quietly supported me came by. We grilled burgers, shared drinks, laughed about the absurdity of the whole ordeal. I even put up a sign that read, "Welcome to Freedom Lane. Watch your step. HOA ahead." Most people took it in good humor. Some even brought folding chairs. Karen watched from her porch the entire time, arms crossed, seething. By now, most of the community had turned against her. She was the one who started it all, and they knew it. She had wasted their time, dragged them into lawsuits, cost the HOA thousands of dollars, and all because she couldn't stand the sight of a tent by the lake. She had gone from self-appointed neighborhood enforcer to social pariah, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. A few weeks later, I was approached again, not by the board this time, but by a group of homeowners asking if I'd be willing to take over a leadership role in the HOA. I nearly laughed. After everything that had happened, they wanted me to lead the very organization that tried to chase me off my land. I politely declined. I told them I wasn't interested in running things. I was interested in keeping things in check. And that's exactly what I did. I kept my boundaries clear, my contracts tight, and my presence known. I wasn't loud, but I was firm. If someone had a problem, I addressed it directly. If they respected my land, I respected theirs. It was simple. No power trips, no fines for mailbox height, no threats over lawn decor. Just neighbors being neighbors, finally. Karen, though, couldn't adapt. She kept trying to enforce unwritten community standards, even after she had no authority. She tried reporting people to a board that no longer listened to her. Eventually, she put her house on the market. The listing didn't mention that her driveway bordered a private access road she had no control over. But word got around, and buyers weren't interested in inheriting the drama. The last I saw of her, she was dragging boxes out to a moving truck, still muttering under her breath. No one came to help. No one waved goodbye. The woman who once ruled with a glare and a clipboard had been quietly removed, not by confrontation, but by consequence. And every morning after that, I woke up, walked to the edge of my land, looked out over the peaceful lake, and reminded myself how all of it started with a single call to 911 over a tent.